I am Brad DeLong, an economics professor at the University of California here at Berkeley, and sometime Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury. This is the weekly DeLong Today briefing. Here I hold forth on the Lee Bureau's Vimeo platform on my guesses as to what I think you most need to know about what our economy is doing to us right now. Now, I promised Wes Neff, back when he agreed to provide the infrastructure for this, that I and my briefings would be lively, interesting, curious, thoughtful, and relatively brief. Relatively. I promised that I would provide briefings on a mix of forecasting, politics, macroeconomic analysis, history, and political economy. Today is an economic history briefing. It is a briefing about the very long run. It is history with a side order of awe at how lucky we are to live in what is by far the most prosperous age and the age in which human life is longest ever that we have ever seen in human history. But first, ooh boy. Think of this. If it had not been for the COVID plague, Trump would have won re-election legitimately. Oh, he still would have lost the popular vote, probably, but his electoral college victory would have been indisputable. Before we could say that they really did not know what they were voting for. They had been told, but they did not really believe. They did not understand the incompetence, the picking a trade war with China that he and his team have had no idea how to fight and have lost. The commitment to a tax cut for the rich so poorly designed that it produced no benefits at all in terms of higher investment in America. And it is downright difficult to design a tax cut on income from investments that does not produce some such benefits. The worst failure at virus plague containment and control in the entire global north. Now, 4 years ago, they understood they were voting for Mr. Grab Them by the Pussy. They did not really understand that they were voting for Mr. Kidnap Kids, Mr. Run Them Off the Road, Mr. Steal Everything You Can, and Mr. Shoot Them Down. Now, they know. And nearly half the country voted for him anyway. And virtually the entire Republican Party continues to not just sit on their hands, but to work diligently to encourage and entrench them. The most important thing from the perspective of the Republican non-deplorables is not good governance or preserving Republican values or preserving American values, but rather keeping the deplorables inside the Republican tent. And that is truly deplorable. So they are all deplorables. As the very sharp Rana Foroohar wrote last week, Xi Jinping and company could not have written a better advertisement, could not have done anything to more strongly indicate that the wave of the future really is Chinese authoritarian state capitalism with some egalitarian aspirations. I'd like to remind you plutocrats and plutocrat identified and plutocrat wannabe in the audience. I want to remind you of one thing. You may think kleptocrats are your friends, but they are not. For them, from their perspective, you are their prey. And I would like to remind you who glory in the idea that even though Trump is incompetent, most of the pain is landing on the people you want to see suffer. You are wrong, for it is your grandma and your ma who had the most to lose in this election and will lose the most from the gridlock you have now created. The lesson that aspiring Republican politicians are hearing and learning is that delivering cruelty and disruption is the road to the hearts of the base, and the next generation is likely to be much more competent than Trump at delivering it. But all of this is not what I am here to talk about today. Back in 1930, as the world spiraled down into the Great Depression, economist John Maynard Keynes took some time out from his trying to stem the rising tide of global unemployment and macroeconomic misery, to take the long view. And his long view was profoundly optimistic. So let me imitate him. Let me attempt to give the long view of human economic history over the past 70,000 years, as our human population has risen perhaps 1 millionfold, from 8,000 to 8 billion, and as we have moved from profound poverty and immense ignorance to substantial knowledge and wealth. Knowledge about us, knowledge about our world, and knowledge about how to manipulate matter and energy and ourselves to set them in patterns that greatly aid us in accomplishing our purposes. I will start by reviewing the human situation starting from 70,000 years ago on up to the invention of agriculture and of animal domestication about 10,000 years ago. I will then cover the 9,700 following years in which nearly all, and the 9,950 years in which most of humanity was trapped in agrarian age destitution. And then I will discuss our modern economic growth age explosion in human wealth. And I will urge you to hold on to that fact, that to all previous centuries, those of us in the middle class of the global north today are all living in a utopia. Now, a utopia due to human invention. Now, humans have always been inventive. Technological advance has rarely stopped. Say, the windmills, dikes, fields, crops, and animals of Holland in 1700 made the economy of its countryside very, very different indeed from the thinly farmed marshes of 700. And the ships that docked at the Chinese port of Canton had much greater range, and the commodities loaded on and off them had much greater value in 1700 than 800. And both commerce and agriculture in 800 were far advanced in technology beyond that of the first civilizations to have literacy, those of the year 3000 or so. But before our modern economic growth age, technological progress led to little visible change over one or even several lifetimes, and to little growth in typical living standards, even over centuries or millennia or multi-millennia. Before 1870, over and over again, technology lost its race with human fecundity. Greater numbers coupled with resource scarcity and a slow pace of technological innovation produced a humanity where most people most of the time could not be confident that in a year they and their families would have their 2,000 calories plus essential nutrients plus a roof over their heads. Before 1870, those successfully on the make had to do so overwhelmingly by focusing on how to take from others and then keep what they had while maintaining order, rather than how to make more for everyone. So let's start by stepping back 70,000 years ago. Back then, the Toba volcano in Indonesia blew up. It left a crater 60 by 20 miles, now filled with a very nice lake, and maybe the resulting volcano winter almost drove us extinct. We all appear to be descended from perhaps 8,000 people who were alive back then. But maybe, perhaps more likely, there were much more than 8,000 of us that survived the volcano winter, but that some 8,000 had a significant evolutionary edge, had developed full language, anyone? And we then outcompeted our cousins in the Darwinian survival of the fittest, taking their ecological niches and expanding our own. But we really don't know. 50,000 years ago, we've gone from 70 to 50, there were perhaps 30,000 of us, our population doubling every 13,000 years, and we were positioned to spread out from Africa to the other continents of the world. Our brains and our languages, you see, made us an anthology intelligence. What one human learned, others could quickly learn and know. And that meant we could find niches and build technologies to allow us to fill them in ecologies very, very different from the one in which we had originally evolved. By that time, some of us, 100 to 500 perhaps, all carrying cellular mitochondria of haplogroup L3, crossed the Red Sea out of Africa and began spreading out all over Eurasia, occasionally picking up genes from other human subgroups. Now in this from 75,000 to 10,000 years ago gatherer-hunter age, life was then short, an average life expectancy at birth of 25 if you were lucky. For the gatherer-hunter lifestyle is very hard on human infants. But life back then had its upsides as well. Back then we were buff and swole with a tasty and nutritious, if low-carb, diet. If you weren't fit, you were rapidly dead, and if you grabbed for the few carbs you could find as aggressively as possible, you had a more favorable energy budget. In addition, each day life presented us with conceptual problems that were interesting and essential for us to solve. Indeed, our brains have been evolved to solve them. And given that our brains burn 25% of our energy solving these puzzles, solving them successfully was very important. By 10,000 years ago, there were about 2.5 million of us scattered across the globe, for by then we had long since crossed to Australia and were found in the Americas as well. But a doubling of population every 10,000 years or so, that's achingly slow on the annual or generational level. That's 0.0054% per year. That's 0.13% per generation. That's 0.5% in 100 years. For every 200 people on average alive at the start of a century, there were 201 alive at the end. Why was population growth so slow? Well, human population rapidly reaches equilibrium in old geographical and ecological niches, and only slowly, painfully discovered and built the technology to move into new ones. Think of the rate of increase of the value of the stock of useful human ideas about technology and organization as growing very, very slowly then. A doubling time of human technological capabilities of 26,000 years. Why so slow? Well, it was hard to invent and discover when there were so few of us, and it was hard to preserve and remember what had been invented and discovered, simply because memory was short and bands were small, unless what had been invented and discovered was immediately and obviously useful. And then about 10,000 years ago, the game changed. We discovered that seeds could be selected and grown, and animals could be domesticated. We discovered agriculture and herding. In some ways, this Neolithic revolution was a bonanza, an El Dorado. Abundance flows. The next tripling of human population takes not 20,000 years, but only 2,000. Food becomes mega available to the gatherer-hunter population moving into agriculture. And the mega inventions of agricultural and herding, plus the fact that once we are settled down, there are both more of us to invent and inventions are easier to remember. These quadruple the human pace of technological advance, we guess, to something like 0.01% per year, and move us from a value of ideas stock doubling time of 26,000 years to one of 6,000 years. But there was a big downside to agriculture. The Malthusian devil became sharper. Any animal in equilibrium with its environment expands its population until, on average, each breeding pair only barely manages to reproduce itself. Numbers expand until food is scarce enough and disease and other predators effective enough to put the population in balance. In the agrarian age starting 10,000 years ago, life was easier. Vulnerable infants did not have to be carried long distances. Predators rarely challenged a settled group without weak stragglers to pick off. So, paradoxically, because life was easier, it became more miserable. The same average level of fitness and nutrition seen in the gatherer-hunter age would have generated substantial population growth. Remember that tripling in 2,000 years, which ended only when farm sizes were so small that levels of fitness and nutrition were so low and vulnerability to diseases so high that, once again, each breeding pair barely managed to reproduce its numbers. Thus, from the perspective of physical development, it looks like the invention of agriculture was in the long run a disaster for the overwhelming bulk of humans. Across the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, people on average become shorter. Adult male heights fell from 5 feet 8 or so to 5 feet 4 or so, or less. There was barely enough land to support the bulk of the existing population on more than a subsistence agricultural diet, one that leaves you stunted. Post-agriculture, people were scrawnier with fewer teeth, more likely to die of the plague, and perhaps stupider. A protein-poor subsistence agriculture diet that leaves you stunted in height, that's not likely to be good for brain development either. And from the perspective of mental engagement, say, It also looks like the invention of agriculture was in the long run a disaster for the overwhelming bulk of humans during the agrarian age, at least. Work became much more repetitive and much more boring. Most of the brain power that we East African plains apes had painfully evolved was underutilized. Now, for an upper class, however, things were substantially different. Gatherer-hunters, they can run away from people who make it a specialty to steal their stuff at spear point. Farmers cannot. And once you have a theft protection ring going, you can spend your time becoming more expert as a practitioner of coercive violence, and so a smaller group can dominate even more farmers and extract even more resources, and spend more time becoming expert violent coercers. Agrarian age upper classes lived well, and lived better as time passed and the set of technologies that they could put their slaves, their serfs, or even their taxpayers to work producing for their benefit increased. And in the early stages of the agrarian age, from, say, 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, we find an interesting, clear record written in our genes. The big claw chart above to your right shows male descent groups, separate Y-Chromosome lineages, and when they diverged by mutation, derived from some 500 individuals alive today scattered across the globe. The number of new tree branches in every interval is roughly proportional to effective male population size. How many men there were then who had the opportunity to generate a long line of descendants. The number of different male lineages that we see today grows, but then between 8,000 and 4,000 it grows only very slowly over that period, as if the male population had fallen back to its levels of 50,000 years ago. Now that is not the case, of course. Male population equals female population, and we know from the expanding number of mutations in the female lineage tract and the expanding number of female lineage groups that total human populations kept growing at a healthy pace. But what it does mean is that only a small proportion of males had the opportunity to breed, and then their sons and grandsons had an opportunity to breed. That most of the male lineages that evolved through mutation were cut short, as at some point down the centuries some rich thug with a spear would take the women who would have become their wives as secondary concubines. Massive social inequality, not only in terms of wealth and access to goods, but in terms of family structure emerged. An enormous amount of social power and pressure must have been present worldwide to produce this early agrarian age Y-chromosome diversity bottleneck. Humanity thus was not only very poor, figure the typical human spending 60% of their energy and income getting their 2,000 calories plus essential nutrients per day, but very unequal. Agriculture and settlement, however, were good for a few things. One was human memory. Another, that greater numbers meant more brains working on inventions, and among those inventions were other things that made human memory and human communication much better. Parchment, papyrus, and clay, pens and inks and styluses, ideographs, and alphabets. So by 1500, 9,500 years or so after the invention of agriculture, human population had risen from 2.5 to 500 million. That's a 200-fold increase in 9,500 years compared to the 25-fold increase in 50,000 years of the gatherer-hunter age before. The average growth rate of the value of the human stock of useful ideas had been 0.00027% per year in the gatherer-hunting age, a doubling time of human technological capabilities of 26000, that's 3 zeros, years. The average growth rate of the value of the human stock of useful ideas in the agrarian age was 0.025% per year, 1 0. A doubling time of human technological capabilities of 2780, 1 0 years. Indeed, from the standpoint of minus 8,000, possibly able to make felt, but not to spin or weave, probably not yet reliably able to turn barley porridge into beer, Even though you have many more impressive technologies than we had back when the Toba supervolcano blew, the technologies of the year 1500, the Ming pottery or the Portuguese caravel or the wet cultivation rice seedling, are very impressive. But did greater knowledge about technology and human organization lead life in 1500 to be much sweeter than it had been in the year minus 8000? It turns out not. The 500 million or so humans arriving live in 1500 upper classes aside, found themselves living at about the same standard of living as earlier in the agrarian age. Figure something like $2.50 per day. Technology had advanced far. If we set our index of human technological capabilities equal to 1 at the invention of agriculture, looking backward we find a value of 0.2 at the time of the Toba explosion, and a value of 11 for the year 1500. But numbers had increased to 500 million, had increased far and fast enough to diminish farm sizes by enough that there was little change in typical standards of living, and the same was to continue for the next 300 years through the commercial and industrial revolution eras. From 1500 to 1870, we do see marvels. We do see the commercial and industrial revolutions. We do see populations rise from 500 million to 1.3 billion, and we do see average living standards rise too by about half, from maybe $2.50 a day to a hair under $4 a day. But average is not typical. Most people were still at the old $2.50 a day. Typical adult male height was still 5'4". Almost all of the increase in average was engrossed by the upper class. Greater numbers still meant smaller farm sizes that would push living standards back down in a world in which the overwhelming bulk of the population were still subsistence farmers. Population growth still ate most of the benefits of innovation and invention in technology and organization. A typical woman, that is, became a mother and was not in the 1/7 who died in childbirth, or the additional 1/5 who died before her children were grown of other causes, spent perhaps 20 years providing nutrition for 2, biologically providing nutrition for 2. 9 pregnancies, 6 live births, 3 children surviving to age 5, and the life expectancy at birth of all her children under and perhaps well under 30, and then 2 or 3 years nursing each child. Keeping your children from dying is the first and highest goal of every parent. Humanity in the agrarian age could not do so. That is an index of how much pressure from material want humanity found itself under as late as 1500, and that amount of pressure did not change in the centuries after. Come 1500 and the age of the commercial revolution, the rate of growth of humanity's technological and organizational capabilities does explode relative to all previous human experience. It took a more than 5-fold upward leap, from the 0.025% per year of the agrarian age to maybe 0.15% per year, and then with the 1770 coming of the Industrial Revolution, takes another 3-fold leap up to about 0.5% per year. Now you can see technological progress in a human lifetime. That is, if you are lucky enough to live until 60, and if your grandfather grandfather had also lived to 60, in those 2 lives, you see a doubling of human technological capabilities. And the technological capabilities developed from 1500 to 1870 were truly marvelous. Ocean-going caravels, and then they turn into screw-propellered iron-holed steamships, printing presses, canals, and clocks, the steam and iron and textiles complex, it's the heart of the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of electrical engineering in the form of telegraph, advanced materials, machine tools, the Columbian Exchange, the spread of corn, the potato, and other incredibly valuable aspects of Amerindian biotechnology to the rest of the world. Yeah, but this growth was not fast enough to break Malthus's spell of poverty. Globally, the rich did live much better, but the typical person saw little benefit, or perhaps a substantial loss, as better technology and organization meant that brutality as well as production, or rather brutal production, could become more powerful, more organized, more routinized. And faster population growth still ate up the possibilities for income improvement. Now, the ice was perhaps breaking before 1800. And was definitely breaking as of 1870. That by 1870, technology and organization had gained a step or two or three on fecundity in their race, at least in the richest countries of the world, at least in Great Britain and the United States and Belgium and northern France. But had there been any post-1870 slackening of the pace of technological or organizational progress? Had there been any major redivision of society's dividends, devoting less to the sinews of peace and more to the sinews of war? And the nasty, brutish, and short of previous ages would have reasserted itself. Writing in 1870, it was no wild-eyed prophet of revolution like Karl Marx, but the sober establishment liberal of the day, John Stuart Mill, who wrote of the system in which he was embedded, quote, "It is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being. They have enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment, and an increased number of manufacturers and others to make fortunes." All right, I have overstated it a bit. He did add, they have increased the comforts of the middle classes. But still, without a further acceleration, a bigger than industrial revolution acceleration of the underlying driver of economic growth, which is the rate of technological progress, today's world might indeed be a steampunk world. The world after 1870 had enough nutrition to support population growth rates like those we have seen. It might have a global population of our current 7.5 billion, probably would, certainly wouldn't have less, because short life expectancy would have meant people would still have desperately wanted to have more children in the hopes that some of them would eventually survive. But those 7.5 billion in steampunk world would be living at little more than the same global standard of living as 1800. Think of a world with today's population, but with technology and organization at about the level of 1910. We might have not 9%, but more like 50% of the world living at or below $2.50, and 90% living below 5 of today's dollars per day. With average farm sizes 1/6 of had they had been in 1800, we still would have had to have kept enormous shares of the labor force on the land to farm intensively to produce enough to eat. And only the uppermost of upper classes in such a steampunk world would have what we would regard as a global north standard of living. But we did get that extra post-1870 innovation growth acceleration, and it did break the ice. Around 1870, the proportional rate of growth of humanity's technological and organizational capabilities took an additional further fourfold upward leap to our current level of perhaps 2% per year globally. And thereafter, technology far outran population growth, especially once societies became rich enough and free enough to teach women to read, and women began to consider that they really wished to limit their fertility. That 3 children might be fine, but 9 pregnancies takes a significant toll. And so population growth in the richest economies began to decline. Each year over 1870, the gap between invention and fecundity grew. And each year over after 1870, John Stuart Mill's belief that the progress of science and technology, of industry and enterprise, had not lightened the day's toil of any human being, or affected great changes in humanity's destiny. Each year after 1870, John Stuart's belief that those things were the case became more and less true, and by 1914, they had become more or less completely false. Since 1870, it has been, in the perspective of all previous eras, what John Maynard Keynes wrote about it back in 1919. An economic El Dorado, an economic utopia. Any earlier economist would have deemed it an unprecedented situation, an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of humanity. So why does each year since 1870 see as much technological and organizational progress as 4 years over 1770-1870, as 12 years over 1500 to 1770, and over 60 in the agrarian ages before 1500? And how did what was originally a geographically concentrated surge become global, albeit unevenly global? Well, there are many more of us, and we have better tools with which to invent, but we've also picked all the low-hanging fruit, so invention is harder. Over and above those two forces, which we might think more or less balance each other, we can gesture to 5 changes. That surely the most important was the development of the Industrial Research Laboratory that meant that inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla could be inventors. They did not have to fulfill the 10 other roles that their predecessors had to fill, from impresario to human resources manager. This made a huge difference. Rationality, professionality, and routine in the development of ideas. And second, closely following in importance, is the coming of the modern corporation. Knowledge not diffused is knowledge useless, and the corporation was the way the knowledge got out of the industrial research lab and down to the production line, rapidly and thoroughly deployed at scale. Third comes the globalization of transport, in the form of the iron-hulled, screw-propellered, ocean-going steamship linked to the railroad network, plus follow-on developments that meant anyone anywhere could participate in this industrial economy. And fourth was the globalization of communications in the form of the global telegraph network, landline and submarine, which allows anyone in the world to talk and communicate, and so participate in the economy. And fifth was a policy choice, a choice of the lack of barriers. The most important lack, perhaps, was a lack of barriers to migration, with the very important caveat that the poorest from China, India, and elsewhere were not allowed into the temperate settlements. Those were reserved for Europeans. That 1 in 14 humans changed their continent between 1870 to 1914, looking for a better life. But also very important were the government blockages to trade and investment and communication. Not only could people move, but finance, machines, railroads, steamships, and the telegraph nerves of production and distribution networks, they could follow, chasing abundant natural, physical, and biological resources. And the consequences have been enormous. Today, less than 9% of humanity lives at or below the roughly $2.50 living standard we think of as extreme poverty, down from 70% of humanity in 1870. And even those 9% have major edges in wealth that the people in 1870 did not. Even those 9% have access to public health and mobile phone communications technologies of vast worth and power. Today, the economies of the world lucky enough to be rich, they stand at levels of per capita prosperity at least 20 and possibly much more times those of previous centuries, with every expectation of future further doublings in the centuries to come. Today, the typical citizens of rich economies can wield powers of mobility, of communication, of creation, and of destruction that approach, if they do not surpass in any dimensions, those attributed to sorcerers in ages past, and often to gods. And even those economies not in the global north, those economies unlucky enough to be classified in the global south, their center of gravity is not the $2.50 or $3 a day living standard of those economies in 1800 or 1870, but 4 times as much, and heading for more. Tell any of those in previous centuries about the wealth, productivity, technology level, and sophisticated productive organizations of the world today. And they would say that with such power and wealth in our collective hands, we are a society of such complete abundance, and surely we must have used this to build a utopia. We would very, very tough time telling them the truth. We would want to change the focus back and point out that in 1870, the daily wages of an unskilled male worker in London, the city there at the forefront of world economic growth and development, his daily wages would buy him and his family about 5,000 calories worth of high-quality bread each. And that was progress. In 1800, it was 4,000 calories. In 1600, some 3,000 calories. Today, the daily wages of an unskilled male worker in London buy him nearly 2,400,000 wheat calories. Now, and from the biological social angle, the wealth creation process of 1870 today has driven it to be the era in which it has ceased to be the case that the typical woman spends 20 years nourishing two biologically, pregnant or breastfeeding. It's the century in which we stopped watching more than half our babies die in miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality, and stopped watching 1 in 7 mothers die in childbed as well. Yet, as of 1870, such an explosion was not foreseen, or at least was not foreseen by many. I mentioned before John Stuart Mill. He has no clue. Denser populations, more and richer plutocrats, a larger middle class. Those are the fruits Mill saw of the Industrial Revolution. He saw humans in 1870 still under the harrow of Malthus, and whatever possibilities for a better world that existed in the womb of better technologies over 1720 to 1870 had been stillborn. That one word Mill uses to describe his world stands out to me: imprisonment. The world Mill saw of 1870 was not just a world of drudgery, a world in which humans had to work long and tiring hours at crafts and tasks that came nowhere near to being sufficiently interesting to engage the full power of an East African plains ape. The world Mill saw was not just a world in which most people were close to the edge of being desperately hungry and justifiably anxious about where their 2,000 calories a day were going to come from next year or next week. The world Mill saw was not just a world of low literacy. The world Mill saw was a world in which humanity was imprisoned, not free, in a dungeon, chained and fettered. And Mill saw only one way out: child licenses. The government needed to take control of human fecundity and require child licenses, prohibiting those who could not properly support and educate their children to reproduce. Only if, then, he said, would mechanical invention wreak great changes in human destiny. Now, Mill had no clue. Had no clue that wealth would pile up fast enough, that women would be confident enough that their descendants would survive long enough, that they would voluntarily limit their fertility, that you did not need the hammer of the state to impinge on human freedom, but simply improving technology and wealth would do the job. Now, there were others who were more optimistic. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had in 1848 already seen science and technology as Promethean forces that would allow humanity to overthrow its mythical old gods and give humanity itself the powers of gods. Science, technology, and the profit-seeking entrepreneurial business class that deployed it had, according to Marx and Engels, quote, during its rule of scarce 100 years, created more massive and more colossal productive forces than of all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? And writing on his own, Engels snarked in their overlooking of the power of science, technology, and engineering. Mere economists like Mill had demonstrated they were little more than paid hacks of the rich. Quote, land, labor, and capital are for the economist the conditions of wealth, and he requires nothing else. Science is of no concern of his. What does it matter to him that he has received its gifts through Berthollet, Davy, Liebig, Watt, Cartwright, etc., gifts that have benefited him and his production immeasurably? He does not know how to calculate such things. The advances of science go beyond his figures. But in a rational order, the mental element certainly belongs among the elements of production and will find its place too. And Marx's few and thin descriptions in works like his Critique of the Gotha Program, of life after the Socialist Revolution, echo very deliberately the descriptions of how people who have attained the kingdom of heaven behave. Each will contribute, quote, according to his ability, quoting from chapter 11, verse 29 of the Acts of the Apostles by Luke, and each will draw on the common abundant store, quote, according to his needs, unquote. Again, quoting from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, verse 35. But these crazy-eyed utopian radicals were exceptional, and they were balanced by others who were much more pessimistic than even Mill. In 1865, then 30-year-old British economist William Stanley Jevons, he made his reputation by prophesying doom for the British economy. It needed to start immediately cutting back on industrial production in order to economize on scarce and increasing valuable coal. No, it was not foreordained. If it were, it surely would have been much more broadly foreseen than it was. Now, the explosive amplification of material wealth, it has carried with us substantial changes in how we live. The laundry ceasing to be a major part of the household's, or rather the household's women's work. Most of us being gatherers or hunters or farmers, hunting, gathering, farming, herding, spinning and weaving, cleaning, digging, smelting and shaping, assembling structures by hand, these are now the occupations of a small and dwindling proportion of humans. And where we do have farmers, herdsmen, manufacturing workers, etc., they are overwhelmingly controllers of machines and increasingly programmers of robots. What do modern people do instead? Increasingly, we push forward the body of knowledge, we educate each other, we doctor and nurse each other, we care for young and old, we entertain, we provide other services to take advantages of the benefits of specialization, and we engage in complicated symbolic interactions that have the emergent effect of distributing status and power and coordinating the 8 billion person division of labor of today's economy. We have crossed a great divide. We act differently, we think differently, we are different. Perhaps the third best-selling novel in the United States in the entire 19th century was Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, by a guy named Edward Bellamy. Bellamy was a populist, and although he rejected the name as socialist, he dreamed of a utopia created by government ownership of industry, the elimination of destructive competition, and the altruistic mobilization of human energies in a way analogous to his vision of the North's collective effort to end slavery in the Civil War. Technological and organizational abundance, he thought, would generate a society of commodity abundance. He therefore wrote a, quote, literary fantasy, a fairy tale of social felicity, as a hanging in midair, far out of the reach of the sordid and material world of the present, cloud palace for an ideal humanity. He throws his narrator in progress forward in time from 1870 to 2000 by an unconvincing plot device to marvel at a well-working rich society. At one point, the narrative protagonist hears the question, "Would you like to hear some music?" He expects his hostess to play the piano, a social accomplishment of upper-class women around 1900. To listen to music on demand, then, you had to have in your house or money nearby an instrument, and somebody trained to play it. But instead, she dials up a live local orchestra on the speakerphone. Bellamy's narrator's reaction, quote, "If we in the 1800s could have devised an arrangement for providing everybody with music in their homes, perfect in quality, unlimited in quantity, suited to every mood, and beginning and ceasing at will, we should have been considered the limit of human felicity already attained." Now think of that. The limit of human felicity. that many technological innovations of the past century have transformed experiences that were rare and valued luxuries, available only to a rich few at great expense, at relatively rare performances of, say, the symphony or the opera, has transformed them into features of modern life that we take so much for granted that they would not even make the top 20 or even the top 100 in an ordered list of what we think our wealth consists of. Yet, we today, even the rich of us, rarely see ourselves as so extraordinarily lucky and fortunate and happy, even though for the first time in human history there are enough calories that it is not necessary that anyone should be hungry, and enough shelter that it is not necessary that anyone should be wet, and there is enough stuff to aid daily life that nobody should feel under the pressure of lack of necessities. For the first time in human history, that is the case. We still have a great deal of poverty, but that's because our wealth is distributed the way it is. It's not because there is not enough to go around. Let us try to hold on to that fact and marvel about it, and think about how we are going to use that fact that makes us a unique generation in human history, a uniquely blessed generation, to build a true utopia. I'm Brad DeLong, and this is today's Brad DeLong briefing. Thank you very much